Because of the high degree of undernourishment which the prisoners suffered, it was natural that the desire for food was the major primitive instinct around which mental life cantered. Let us observe the majority of prisoners when they happened to work near each other and were, for once, not closely watched. They would immediately start discussing food. One fellow would ask another working next to him in the ditch what his favorite dishes were. Then they would exchange recipes and plan the menu for the day when they would have a reunion, the day in a distant future when they would be liberated and return home. They would go on, picturing it all in detail, until suddenly a warning was passed down the trench, usually in the form of a special password or number. The guard is coming. I always regarded the discussion about food as dangerous. Is it not wrong to provoke the organism with such detailed and effective pictures of delicacies when it has somehow managed to adapt itself to extremely small rations and low calories? Though it may afford momentary psychological relief, it is an illusion which psychologically surely must not be without danger. During the later part of our imprisonment, the daily ration consisted of very watery soup given out once daily, and the usual small bread ration. In addition to that, there was the so-called extra allowance, consisting of three-fourths of an ounce of margarine, or a slice of poor quality sausage, or of a little piece of cheese, or a bit of synthetic honey, or a spoonful of watery jam, varying daily. In calories, this diet was absolutely inadequate, especially taking into consideration our heavy manual work and our constant exposure to the cold and inadequate clothing. The sick who were under special care, that is, those who were allowed to lie in the huts instead of leaving the camp for work, were even worse off. When the last layers of subcutaneous fat had vanished, and we looked like skeletons disguised with skin and rags, we could watch our bodies beginning to devour themselves. The organism digested its own protein, and the muscles disappeared. Then the body had no powers of resistance left. One after another, the members of the little community in our hut died. Each of us could calculate with fair accuracy whose turn would be next, and when his own would come. After many observations, we knew the symptoms well, which made the correctness of our prognosis quite certain. He won't last long, or this is the next one, we whispered to each other, and when, during our daily search for lice, we saw our own naked bodies in the evening, we thought alike. This body here, my body, is really a corpse already. What has become of me? I am but a small portion of a great mass of human flesh, of a mass behind barbed wire, crowded into a few earthen huts, a mass of which daily a certain portion begins to rot because it has become lifeless. I mentioned above how unavoidable were the thoughts about food and favorite dishes which forced themselves into the consciousness of the prisoner whenever he had a moment to spare. Perhaps it can be understood then that even the strongest of us was longing for the same, for the time when he would have fairly good food again, not for the sake of good food itself, but for the sake of knowing that the subhuman existence which had made us unable to think of anything other than food would at last cease. Those who have not gone through a similar experience can hardly conceive of the soul-destroying mental conflict and clashes of willpower which a famished man experiences. They can hardly grasp what it means to stand digging in a trench, listening only for the siren to announce 9:30 or 10 a.m., the half-hour lunch interval, when bread would be rationed out as long as it was still available, repeatedly asking the foreman if he wasn't a disagreeable fellow what the time was, and tenderly touching a piece of bread in one's own coat pocket, first stroking it with frozen gloveless fingers, then breaking off a crumb and putting it in one's mouth, and finally, with the last bit of willpower, pocketing it again, having promised oneself that morning to hold out till afternoon. We could hold endless debates on the sense or nonsense of certain methods of dealing with the small bread ration which was given out only once daily during the latter part of our confinement. There were two schools of thought. One was in favor of eating up the ration immediately. This had the twofold advantage of satisfying the worst hunger pangs for a very short time, at least once a day, and of safeguarding against possible theft or loss of the ration. The second group, which held with the dividing the ration up, used different arguments. I finally joined their ranks. The most ghastly moment of the 24 hours of camp life was the awakening, when at a still At a still nocturnal hour, the 3 shrill blows of a whistle tore us pitilessly from our exhausted sleep and from the longings in our dreams. We then began the tussle with our wet shoes, into which we could scarcely force our feet, which were sore and swollen with edema, and there were the usual moans and groans about petty troubles, such as the snapping of wires which replaced shoelaces. One morning I heard someone, whom I knew to be brave and dignified, cry like a child because he finally had to go to the snowing marching grounds in his bare feet, as his shoes were too shrunken for him to wear. In those ghastly minutes I found a little bit of comfort, a small piece of bread which I drew out of my pocket and munched with absorbed delight. Undernourishment, besides being the cause of the general preoccupation with food, probably also explains the fact that the sexual urge was generally absent. Apart from the initial effects of shock, this appears to be the only explanation of a phenomena which a psychologist was bound to observe in those all-male camps. That, as opposed to all other strictly male establishments, such as army barracks, there was little sexual perversion. Even in his dreams, the prisoner did not seem to concern himself with sex, although his frustrated emotions, and his finer, higher feelings did find definite expression in them. With the majority of the prisoners, the primitive life and the effort of having to concentrate on just saving one's skin led to a total disregard of anything not serving that purpose, and explained the prisoner's complete lack of sentiment. This was brought home to me on my transfer from Auschwitz to a camp affiliated with Dachau. The train which carried us, about 2,000 prisoners, passed through Vienna. At about midnight we passed one of the Viennese railway stations. The track was going to lead us past the street where I was born, past the house where I had lived many years of my life, in fact, until I was taken prisoner. There were 50 of us in the prison car, which had 2 small barred peepholes. There was only enough room for one group to squat on the floor, while the others, who had to stand up for hours, crowded round the peepholes, standing on tiptoe and looking past the others' heads through the bars of the windows. I caught an eerie glimpse of my native town. We all felt more dead than alive, since we thought that our transport was heading for the camp at Mauthausen, and that we had only 1 or 2 weeks to live. I had a distinct feeling that I saw the streets, the squares, and the houses of my childhood with the eyes of a dead man who had come back from another world and was looking down on a ghostly city. After hours of delay, the train left the station, and there was a street, my street. The young lads, who had a number of years of camp life behind them, and for whom such a journey was a great event, stared attentively through the peephole. I began to beg them, to entreat them, to let me stand in front for one moment only. I tried to explain how much a look through that window meant to me just then. My request was refused with rudeness and cynicism. You lived here all those years? Well then, you have seen quite enough already. Thank you.